Here is Vinta Maskara, a purple ink.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
This is a light pastel kind of a purple that I felt disappointed to have inked up in such a special pen. Thankfully, we do get some tone variation by paper, though often it causes it to look kind of blue over being purple, but it does generally shade well. It does a well enough job on non-fountain pen friendly paper, though it isn't saying much given my general disappointment with this ink. I do have to say this ink isn't bad as an ink. For those that really do like lighter pastel type of purples, I think it would be great, but it definitely isn't for me.
The pen for today is a Pilot 100th Anniversary Benzi 10 with a medium nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we really do get to see that light pastel purple kind of a look here. Very light. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does shade, and I want to say thankfully, because at times it gets very light. Like looking at flowing on the first line, very light through most all of the words. It's the dot of the I and the downstroke of the G that do get a little bit darker. The same thing happens on and right next to it, where most of the word is light. It's the downstroke of the D. And unfortunately, I experienced that a whole lot in this ink, not really putting it into a realm that would make me want to use it frequently or again. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, to no surprise.
Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Vinta Viloet.
Here is Vinta Heritage Brown Panama. Here is Vinta Mulberry Ubi.
Here is Vinta Ochre. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
The tone we get here is, thankfully, a slight bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, I say slight because it is very slight. Still very light and pastel, which I don't think is doing the best for this ink, at least for me. Now, it's not feathering and it's not spreading. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, without a doubt. If you look at without on the first line, you see the cross of the first T and the whole second T are quite a bit darker than the rest of the word. But look at measure right next to that, where it's mostly the lighter tone with occasional midtones, but the midtones we see on both of the E's are still very light to see. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
The tone we get here is where it shifts towards looking a little bit more greenish turquoise. And not fully green. It gets to be a little bit more turquoisey looking here for sure. There's a bit of a tone shift. A result of the paper showing really that this ink is a little bit more translucent. Now, it doesn't feather or spread. There are a couple tiny moments of shading, though there's really only a couple tiny ones to point out, like the HE of hearth on the first line or the G of glooming on the first line. Not much, and really still a very light tone. So if you like this, then enjoy the heck out of it, but I'm not coming back to it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. I don't think it shades as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. The most important thing that we're really looking at here is how does it stand out against the quad rule? And surprise, looking at this, it doesn't. You mostly see the quad rule. It really gets buried in this, making it a horrible ink to use on this type of paper. You're really not going to get to see your writing at all. Looking at the back of the page, we get no surprises as we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Mont Blanc Beatles Psychedelic Purple. Here is Montegrappa Harry Potter Night Bus. Here is Monteverde Amethyst. Here is Pelican 4001 Violet.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
The tone we're getting here is lighter, more muted, and a little bit blue compared to the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. There's a couple moments of shading that do occur. Most importantly is it melts into the background, disappearing with this quad rule. If a student were using this in their lab notebook, I would probably knock them down a few points just for making such a poor decision in how to take important notes. This really is not going to be a great ink for many students to use. Just look at how poor the performance really is here. This, I don't know how well I could really read most of it back. It gets hard to read. But looking at the back of the page, we do get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Diamine Light Green. Here is Geherbin Gris Nuage. Here is Pen BBS number 140. Here is Colorverse Desert Storm.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
The tone on the page here is thankfully darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. I think this is some of the most readable that we had here. Now, there's a tiny bit of feathering, but with it being such a light ink, it's harder to see. You see it on the cross of the T in out on the second line. There's a little bit of spread, which I do think is helping in this case. There is a couple of moments of shading that do occur, like I pointed out, the cross of the T of out on the second line or E of the on the first line. However, when it does a little bit of shading, you get a little bit more feathering. All of that aside, I think this is one of the best showings of this ink, meaning if you have this and really needed to use it up, perhaps this paper is a really good way to go because at least it is readable here without hurting your eyes. Looking at the back of the page, with how light this ink was, I was surprised about how deep into the paper it really did get. And I think even with this ink, if you were writing on the back of the page, you might make it start to be confusing to read back because of the splotting that you'll see on both sides. Of course, it didn't touch the page underneath, which is good news for the ink.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This Pilot Benzi 10 has a dry to medium flow, medium fine nib, and was by far the wrong pen for this ink. So off camera, I went for a wet medium nib, and it darkened it enough to be happy with and had a little bit of shading. So obviously then, this needs to be with a wet pen, regardless of its nib size. And that's just to darken it to a point that you can read this without straining your eyes.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.